that afternoon began like hundreds of others. There were no warning signs, no clear premonition. No one thought this would be the last time. She left a familiar place with hurried steps, but not in panic. On her face was an ordinary kind of exhaustion, the exhaustion of someone who simply wanted to get home earlier than usual. In her mind, it might have been dinner waiting, a phone call she hadn't yet made, or a small promise she believed she would still have time to keep. No one saw fear. No one heard a cry for help. Only time moved on quietly, as if everything were still following its normal course. If someone had paid closer attention, they might have noticed one very small detail. A moment of hesitation, a glance over her shoulder, a decision that seemed meaningless at the time, but later became the fragile line between returning home and disappearing. Our culture teaches us that terrible things usually come with warnings, that tragedy always knocks before it enters. But the truth is, it doesn't always work that way. Some fateful days arrive gently, so quietly that no one realizes they are standing at a moment that will change everything. Her phone remained silent. The familiar road was still there. The world kept moving forward. Only one person never came back. Later, people would ask countless questions. Why did she leave at that time? Why did no one notice anything unusual? How could a person disappear without leaving behind a single clear trace? But on that afternoon, no questions were asked. No one stopped. No one knew that a long, painful, and haunting story was just beginning. Her final moments passed in silence. No gunshots. No flashing lights. No police tape. Just a person stepping out of her familiar life and unknowingly stepping into something from which there was no return. And the biggest question, the one that still lingers to this day, remains unanswered. What really happened in those final minutes when no one was there to witness it? Before she became a name in a case file, she was simply an ordinary person. Someone you might pass on the street without remembering her face, but if you talked long enough, you would remember the feeling she left behind. She grew up in a family that wasn't perfect, but warm enough. Not wealthy, not deprived. Family meals weren't always abundant, but they always came with conversation, with presence. She learned independence early not because she wanted to, but because circumstances quietly taught her that lesson. Those who knew her often described her as reserved, not loud, never seeking to be the center of any room, but she had a habit of listening deeply, patiently. When she nodded, the other person knew she was truly listening, not just waiting for her turn to speak. Her dreams were small, not the kind often mentioned in speeches, just a more stable job, a quiet home, a life where coming back each evening didn't come with fear about what tomorrow might bring. To her, peace was something tangible. It had shape, scent, and sound. She remembered small things with remarkable clarity. Who drank their coffee black? Who couldn't eat onions? An old appointment once missed, and she would try hard not to let that happen again. Perhaps because of this, she often placed others before herself, sometimes to the point of forgetting that she, too, deserved care. In her family, she was the one who called most often, not to share big news, but to ask simple questions. Are you tired today? Have you eaten? Is it cold where you are? Questions that seemed insignificant until one day they stopped coming, and people realized how deeply they had grown used to them. Her friends remembered her through ordinary details. The way she smiled softly instead of laughing out loud, the way she stayed quiet when she disagreed, then gently expressed her thoughts, the way she apologized even when the fault wasn't entirely hers. Not because she was weak, but because she disliked conflict. Some afternoons, after a long day, all she wanted was to get home quickly, take off her shoes, sit down, let her mind be quiet for a few rare minutes. To her, that was the reward for a day spent trying to live properly, fully, without disturbing anyone else. No one thought her life was dangerous. No one saw her as someone likely to run into trouble. She didn't live a nightlife. She wasn't involved in complicated relationships. She had no clear enemies. She existed in this world quietly, like millions of others. And that is what makes this story more frightening. Because if someone like her could disappear, it means you don't have to be different, or reckless, or flawed for tragedy to find you. Before that fateful day, no one knew they were seeing her for the last time. No one said goodbye thinking it would be the final one. Life continued as usual, and it was that very normalcy that concealed a tragedy silently drawing closer. She didn't know she was about to step into a story where her name would be spoken in a way no one would ever want. A story where every action, every decision, every moment of her life would be analyzed just to answer a single question. How could someone like her simply disappear? That day began in the most ordinary way. So ordinary that no one had a reason to remember it. There was no anniversary, no special event, just another day, following the many familiar days that had repeated themselves for far too long in her life. The morning passed as it always did. She woke up and prepared for the day with movements that had become routine. Not rushed, not slow. She left home with a simple plan in mind. Finish work, go back, rest. A familiar sequence she had followed hundreds of times before. No one knew that among the many small decisions made that day, one would lead her farther than intended. It wasn't an obviously wrong decision, just a slight change in her usual route, one extra errand, one place to stop by before heading home. By the afternoon, people around her still saw nothing unusual. No signs of distress, no panic. She spoke briefly, answered just enough, her eyes showing a hint of fatigue but no fear. If anyone had asked what she was thinking, she might have said she simply wanted to get home earlier than usual. From this point on, time would become important. Every minute, every small moment would later be pieced together, analyzed, examined. But at the time, no one was watching the clock. No one realized that each passing minute was carrying a different weight. There was a call that was never made, a message that was never sent, small things that would later become sources of deep regret. If only there had been one more action, one more delay, one more change, perhaps everything would have turned out differently. When she left the last place where she was seen, everything still seemed intact. There were no signs of a struggle, no screams, no witnesses stepping forward to say they had seen something unusual. She walked away as if she were simply leaving behind a long workday. The route she took was not unfamiliar. These were roads she knew well, paths she could walk without needing to look at street signs. That familiarity lowered her guard, and it caused others to pay no attention. As the afternoon light began to fade, silence slowly appeared. At first, it was barely noticeable. A call unanswered. A message without a reply. Things like that happen every day. Everyone gets busy. Everyone forgets to check their phone sometimes. But the silence lasted longer than usual. Too long to ignore, too different to dismiss as coincidence. Her loved ones began to feel uneasy, even though they couldn't yet name what they were feeling. A vague worry, unclear, but steadily growing heavier. When night fell, the optimistic assumptions began to disappear. She didn't come home as she usually did. There was no message to explain her absence, no clear reason to account for it. Questions started to surface, though no one was ready to face the answers. There were moments that day that, if played back in slow motion, might reveal tiny details. A passing glance, a paused step, a moment of hesitation before moving on. But everything happened too quickly, and no one knew they needed to remember them. That night, when people finally realized that something was truly wrong, the fateful day had already ended. She was no longer where she was supposed to be. And from that moment on, the story was no longer about an ordinary day. That day, once forgotten, became the most frequently revisited point in time. Every small detail would be repeated again and again in the years that followed. Not to change the outcome, but to try to understand one thing. How tragedy began when everything still felt completely normal. The unease didn't arrive all at once. It appeared gradually, like a tiny crack forming on a surface that still seemed intact. At first, everyone believed she was simply running late. Maybe her phone had died. Maybe work had taken longer than expected. Maybe she just needed a little more time before heading home. But as the minutes passed without any response, the silence began to take on a different meaning. It was no longer the familiar kind of busyness, no longer a delay that could be easily explained. It became an uncomfortable void, one that made people repeatedly check the clock, then glance back at their phones, hoping for any sign of life. The first call was made with a calm voice. The second carried a hint of worry. By the third call, they were dialing just to hear any sound on the other end of the line. But the only response was prolonged silence. When optimistic assumptions no longer felt convincing, her loved ones began to search in the most instinctive way. They went to places she often visited, asked familiar questions to familiar people. Every answer was the same. No one had seen anything unusual. No one remembered encountering her after a certain point. Then, One detail emerged, small but enough to change the atmosphere completely. Her car was found in a place that didn't match her usual habits. It wasn't damaged. There were no signs of tampering. The doors were locked. Everything looked perfectly normal, and that very normalcy sent a chill through everyone who saw it. Inside the car, her belongings were still there, the personal items she always carried with her. There were no signs of haste, no signs of struggle. Nothing suggested she had planned to leave for a long time. The car sat motionless, as if waiting for its owner to return and finish an unfinished errand. In that moment, hope and fear existed side by side. Hope that she was still nearby, that she would come back, that this was all a terrible misunderstanding. But fear whispered something else. If everything was still intact, then where had she gone, and why? Her family stood at the scene, unsure where to look first. Every small detail felt significant. The way the car was parked, an item slightly out of place, a trace too faint to be certain. They looked away, afraid they were imagining too much, yet equally afraid they were missing the most important clue of all. When the police were notified, the atmosphere shifted noticeably. Questions became more precise. Timelines were recorded more carefully. Assumptions began to form, even if no one was ready to say them out loud. From that moment on, this was no longer just the family's private worry. Still, in those first few hours, hope remained. Hope that she had simply gone somewhere and would soon reappear. Hope that everything would end with an apologetic phone call for causing so much concern. Hope that this fear was unfounded. But as night fell, that hope began to thin. The silence had lasted too long to be dismissed as coincidence. The questions could no longer be easily pushed aside. With every passing minute, the number of possible explanations grew smaller. The realization that something was wrong did not come in a sudden explosion. It came slowly, painfully, as people began to accept that something had gone terribly wrong, that someone had disappeared, not in an instant, but in a silence so complete it was terrifying. And from that moment on, fear was no longer a vague feeling. It became reality. A reality no one was ready to face, but no one could turn away from. The investigation did not begin with certainty, but with a long list of assumptions. In the first hours, people still clung to the belief that she had only disappeared temporarily, that she might return, that this was not yet a serious case. That way of thinking shaped the earliest steps and would go on to deeply influence everything that followed. Police arrived at the scene cautious but not truly urgent. They documented the time, the location, what could be seen, the car, the personal belongings. There were no clear signs of an attack, no blood, no disturbance. Everything made the scene look like a temporary interruption rather than an unfolding tragedy. The first questions focused on her personal life. Was she facing any difficulties? Had she argued with anyone? Did she have any reason to leave on her own? Family and friends gave the same answers. She didn't have a habit of disappearing. She didn't cut off contact. She didn't live in a way that made people worry. Even so, in the early days, the possibility that she had left voluntarily remained on the table. Not because there was clear evidence, but because there wasn't enough evidence to rule it out. The lack of concrete clues left the investigation stuck between multiple directions, none strong enough to become the focus. Police began speaking with the last people known to have seen her. Short conversations, vague memories. No one recalled exact times. No one noticed anything unusual. The accounts didn't contradict one another, but they didn't add anything new either. Each witness brought a small flicker of hope, only for it to fade just as quickly. As time passed, pressure began to build. The family wanted answers. Friends wanted action. But the investigative system moved at a different pace, slower than the emotions of those waiting. Every decision required evidence. Every step needed justification. And when that foundation was unclear, hesitation followed. There were details that, in hindsight, should have been examined more closely. A familiar route that had been altered. A gap in time no one could explain. A statement that sounded ordinary, but in the right context might have meant something else. At the time, however, none of these details stood out enough to be prioritized. The investigation expanded, then narrowed again. Names were introduced, then quickly removed. Not because they were proven innocent, but because there wasn't enough reason to continue pursuing them. Each time that happened, an opportunity slipped away quietly and irreversibly. Her family began to feel that time was no longer on their side. Each day without progress thinned what little hope remained. They learned how to repeat their story to different people, learned how to answer the same questions again and again, learned how to be patient even as something inside them slowly ran out. Meanwhile, life outside continued. The roads stayed busy, afternoons passed just like the day she disappeared. That contrast made the pain sharper. To the world, this was one case among many. To the family, it was their entire life. There were moments when even investigators felt the stalemate. They stared at the file, at the notes, at lines of text that offered no answers. No one said it out loud, but everyone understood without an early breakthrough, this case risked fading into obscurity. The initial investigation ended not with a conclusion, but with the absence of one. No clear answers, no definite direction, only a cold reality. A person had vanished, and all that remained was a chain of unanswered questions. And in that empty space, time continued to move forward, carrying hope, carrying opportunity, and carrying the growing fear that the truth, if it existed at all, was slowly being buried by the passing years. When a case turns cold, the first thing that disappears is not the evidence, but the urgency. Phones stop ringing constantly. Back-to-back meetings become less frequent. Reports are filed away, numbered, labeled, and placed into cabinets, where they remain untouched. No one says it out loud, but everyone understands. This case is no longer a priority. Time moves forward with quiet cruelty. Roads once wrapped in police tape return to normal. Forests that were once searched inch by inch begin to grow new leaves. Traces are erased not by people, but by nature itself. Every rainfall, every winter, every shift of the ground pushes the truth a little farther away. In the investigative files, her name is still there, not crossed out, not closed, but no longer spoken. An unsolved disappearance, preserved as if time itself might one day bring answers back. But time does not do that. Time only makes things quieter. Her family feels this change more clearly than anyone. Early promises slowly turn into careful responses. We're still monitoring the case. We'll contact you if there's new information. No one is lying, but no one is saying they still have hope. Each time the phone rings, their hearts race for a split second, only to sink when they realize it's just an ordinary call. The posters pinned at gas stations, post offices, and community boards begin to fade. Rain blurs the ink. Wind tears the paper. Her face is still there, but her eyes grow more unfamiliar to those who pass by. To the town, the story slowly becomes a memory. To the family, it never becomes the past. A cold case has no clear ending. It simply slows down, then stops. Investigators are reassigned to other files, newer cases, more urgent ones. Not because they forget, but because the system forces choices to be made. And cases without a body, without witnesses, are always the easiest to leave behind. Some nights, her mother stays awake very late, not waiting for news but unable to sleep. She keeps a small light on outside the house, as if that glow might guide her daughter home if she ever returns. No one tells her to stop. Everyone understands that this is the only way she knows how to keep living. Within the community, rumors begin to replace facts. People whisper theories to one another. A stranger, an accident, a mistake no one wants to name. Each retelling shifts slightly until no one remembers what was confirmed and what was imagined. Uncertainty becomes part of the case itself. Year after year, the date of her disappearance remains unforgettable to her family but forgotten by the world. There are no press releases, no new articles, only a long, heavy silence, settling like dust over everything. A cold case does not mean the case is dead. It means the truth has been buried beneath time, waiting for something strong enough to pull it back into the light. A word spoken, a mistake revealed, an unexpected change. Until then, those left behind must learn how to live with a question that has no answer. And it is in that quiet space, when no one is watching, when everything seems forgotten, that the truth waits patiently, not to be found quickly, but to be found at the right moment. Many years had passed since the case slowly faded into obscurity. The town changed. Roads were repaved, old shops closed. A younger generation grew up knowing almost nothing about the tragedy that once cast a shadow over this place. But for the victim's family, time had not healed anything. Each passing year was merely another layer of dust settling over a pain that had never been fully named. On an afternoon that seemed entirely ordinary, An old case file was pulled from a storage cabinet. Not because of a special order, not because of media pressure. It was simply a young investigator, newly transferred, spending time reviewing unresolved cases. As he turned the yellowed pages, he noticed details that had once been considered too small to pursue, contradictory statements, unexplained gaps in the timeline, pieces of evidence set aside because technology at the time had not been capable of analyzing them. At the same time, forensic science had entered a new era. Materials once thought worthless could now tell their own stories. A strand of hair, a faint fingerprint, a biological sample sealed away and forgotten. They were brought back into the lab, not with certainty, but with the fragile hope that the truth was still there, patiently waiting to be called by name. After years of silence, the victim's family received a phone call. It was not a promise, not a conclusion, just a notice that the case was being reviewed again. For them, that alone was enough to awaken memories they believed had long been asleep. The old pain resurfaced, but this time it was accompanied by something else. The feeling that they were no longer alone in their long wait. As investigators compared old records with new findings, one name began to appear more frequently in the file. Years earlier, it had surfaced briefly, only to be dismissed for lack of direct evidence. Now, as the pieces were placed side by side, the picture began to change. Statements once thought disconnected started to align. Behaviors once dismissed as coincidence took on new meaning. There was no dramatic breakthrough, no celebration, only a heavy silence in the meeting room, as investigators realized they were getting very close to the truth, close enough that there was no turning back. Every step forward carried greater responsibility because behind every discovery were real people, real lives. When the summons was signed, it was more than a legal formality. It was the result of decades of waiting, of questions left unanswered, of a community that had learned to live alongside a mystery. The news spread quickly, stirring the small town once again. Those who believed the case had been buried forever were now forced to face the past. For the victim's family, this turning point did not bring pure joy. It brought caution, restraint, and the fear that hope might once again be taken away. But this time, they chose to believe not because they were certain, but because they had waited too long to deny themselves the chance to hope one more time. This long-delayed turning point was more than the revival of an investigation. It was a reminder that time may blur memory, but it cannot erase the truth. And sometimes, justice does not arrive early or on time, but it still moves forward quietly, step by step, patiently, much like the people who never stopped waiting for it. That morning began like any other. No sirens, no hurried footsteps, just a silence so heavy it felt suffocating. Investigators had prepared for this moment for months, some for years, but when it finally arrived, no one spoke. Everyone understood that a single mistake could cause everything to collapse. When they knocked on the door, the man standing behind it had no idea his life was about to turn in a direction from which there would be no return. He opened the door with the calmness of someone who believed the past had been buried deep enough. There was no resistance. No dramatic scene like in the movies. Just a brief flicker in his eyes when his name was read aloud, along with the reason for the arrest. A moment that lasted only seconds, but long enough to reveal that old memories had just been dragged back into the light. News of the arrest spread quickly. The small town, once quiet, slipped into a state of disbelief. Some felt relief. Justice, at last, had spoken. Others were stunned to realize that the man in handcuffs was a familiar face. Someone they had passed on the street. Someone they had greeted like anyone else. Past and present collided, creating a shock no one had prepared for. For the victim's family, the moment did not feel like a victory. It felt like another door opening, one that led back to painful memories they had tried so hard to forget. They watched the arrest footage on television without celebration, in silence. Because they knew this was not the end. It was only the beginning of another journey, one where the truth would have to be proven through testimony, through evidence, and through human endurance. Inside the interrogation room, the silence continued. Questions were asked slowly, precisely. No pressure, no rushed conclusions, only patience and evidence that had been carefully prepared. Each detail presented was like a shard of glass, reflecting a past the suspect could no longer avoid. When the cell door finally closed, it was not just the moment a man lost his freedom. It was the moment a cold case officially came back to life, carrying with it the full weight of time, memory, and decades of waiting. The trial began under a heavy atmosphere. No one came here for entertainment. Everyone carried different expectations. The prosecutors sought justice. The defense sought reasonable doubt. The victim's family sought answers. And the defendant, dressed simply, sat in silence, facing a past he once believed had vanished. The early days of the trial moved slowly. Evidence was presented piece by piece, without haste. Forensic experts explained analyses made possible only by modern technology. Details once dismissed as vague were now placed into a clear and logical sequence. Not every question had an immediate answer, but the overall picture gradually began to take shape. Witnesses took the stand. Some trembled, having gone far too long without revisiting old memories. Others struggled to speak as they realized that, for all these years, they had lived alongside the truth without knowing it. Each testimony was not just information for the jury, it was a fragment of the community's memory where the case had left a scar so deep that people had learned to avoid speaking of it altogether. The victim's family sat quietly in the gallery, watching. There were moments when they had to step out of the courtroom, overwhelmed by emotion, but they returned. They had waited too long for this moment. They did not want the truth to be spoken in that room without the presence of those who had lost the most. When closing arguments began, the courtroom seemed to freeze. The prosecutor did not speak with anger, but with resolve. They revisited every piece of evidence, every point in the timeline, every coincidence that was no longer coincidence at all. The defense attempted to plant final seeds of doubt, but time was not on their side. The moment the jury returned was one the entire room held its breath for. When the verdict was read, there were no cheers, only quiet tears. Not because of victory, but because after so many years of silence, the truth had finally been named. The trial ended, but its aftershocks lingered. For the community, it was a reminder that the past does not disappear simply because people stop talking about it. For the victim's family, it was a form of closure, not complete, but necessary. And for society, it stood as proof that even when justice arrives late, it can still arrive if people refuse to stop searching for the truth. After the trial ended, the town did not immediately return to what it once was. The roads were still there, the houses still stood in silence, but the atmosphere had changed. A case once forgotten had become something people spoke about in hushed voices, not with curiosity, but with a mix of relief and heaviness. The truth had finally been spoken, yet it came at a cost that could not be measured by time or by a sentence handed down in court. For the victim's family, life entered a different chapter. They no longer woke each morning asking who had done it. But the absence of their loved one remained present in every ordinary moment. Justice offered a form of closure, but never compensation. All they could do was continue living, carrying memory with them, and hoping that the story of the one they lost would never be forgotten again. The local community was forced to confront itself as well. People looked back on the passing years and wondered whether there had been signs overlooked, warnings left unheard. Some felt guilt for once, believing the case would never be solved. Others came to understand that silence, whether accidental or deliberate, can extend another person's pain for decades. The case left a lasting mark on how investigators viewed old files. It became proof that a cold case does not mean a dead case. Advances in forensic science, combined with human persistence, can bring light to corners long thought permanently dark. Other cases were reopened not only in hope of finding perpetrators, but out of belief that every victim deserves to be heard. For society at large, the story raises an unavoidable question. How do we treat collective memory? Tragedies fade quickly once they disappear from headlines, but for those directly affected, they never truly end. The aftershocks of a case do not lie in the arrest or the verdict, but in how it continues to shape lives long after the media lights have gone out. The legacy of this case is not just a sentence imposed. It is a reminder that time does not stand on the side of truth if people stop searching. It is proof that justice, even when delayed, still carries meaning not only for the victim, but for an entire community that once lived in the shadow of doubt and silence. When the story finally closes, what remains is not curiosity, but reflection. Reflection on what was lost, on what might have been different had the truth been heard sooner, and on the responsibility each of us carries when faced with unanswered stories, not to turn away, not to forget, and not to allow another person's pain to sink into silence once again. That is the longest lasting aftershock of this case. Not loud, not dramatic, but powerful enough to remind us that behind every file is a human life. And behind every truth brought to light is a quiet reminder that justice, no matter how late, has always been worth waiting for.